Good morning, friends, and welcome to Awaken and the new Awaken Sunday morning talk show. I'm Micah. This is my friend Becky Patton.
Hello, everyone.
If you tuned in last week, we had an interesting conversation in our series Lost in Translation about the book called Song of Songs, also known as Song of Solomon, which is an ancient Hebrew love poem about the nature of love and desire and passion and sex. And as I was thinking about, where do we go from here, since it was the first time I'd ever talked about it, I thought, I wonder if we could continue this conversation in maybe a little bit different format. And my dearest friend Becky has spent a lot of her vocational life in this intersection between spirituality and sexuality. And so I thought it would be fun just to press record and kind of see where this goes. So both Becky and I are a little nervous. We're a little anxious, but I can feel my heart beating in my ears, which I know I'm alive then. So a couple of things just before we get going, as it relates to announcements and the life of our church. Coming up is on the 27th, so Thursday of this week. There is an opportunity for you to come and be a part of a time in the church from 4 to 7 p.m. The church will be open, and it's open for prayer and meditation, reflection, contemplation. The Eucharist will be available for you. So know that. We'll have you enter the main door in the front, and you'll exit out this door on my right, my left, your right, kind of by the nursery there. And there'll be folks helping with safety and sanitization and all of that. We have no idea how many people are going to come to this, so just be cognizant of the number of people who show up and how much time you're here. If that becomes an issue, we'll certainly be here and talking about it as it happens. So, other than that, summer's winding down and fall is almost upon us. It's hard. That's crazy to say.
I'm not ready for it.
I know. No one ever is, especially
ready.
Minnesotans.
And there's no state fair.
No state fair. Man, It's like the passage of time. How will we know? How will we know?
True.
Summer is over. So eat lots of corn. That's how you'll know, instead of going to the corn roast. The reason I said that was because coming soon is more details about kind of fall and what that's going to look like and things that we're going to offer, ways that you can be connected to the life of the community. And so welcome. If you're new, to Awaken. So glad you're here. We'd love to know who you are, so feel free to email any of the staff. All of our emails are on the website, and we'd love to know who you are and your story of how you got here. So please feel free to do that. Okay, Becky, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, we're going to talk about sex and Song of Songs. First off, Song of Songs. What a book, eh?
Awesome book. Awesome book that literally in the Jewish faith, children are not allowed to read it until they turn 13.
No kidding. So at bar mitzvah.
Cannot read it until they're 13 because it's considered such an erotic book. So we can use the word erotic and Bible in the same context when we actually understand and we look at the context of what's actually in this book.
Yeah.
And I think in the Hebrew tradition, it's in the Jewish tradition, it's fair to say that they have a reverence for it and a reckoning that reading this book actually can create and awaken desire.
Yeah.
So.
And somehow it's still connected to life with God.
Still connected to.
Deeply connected with
Deeply connected, and that's something that they try to instill a reverence to. I just think it's just powerful to think of in that way. So.
That is fascinating.
Love the book.
Yeah.
Absolutely love the book.
I had a question somewhere in the midst of that, and while trying to listen to your answer and I've forgotten what it is.
Okay.
But.
Do you want me to come up with a question? This talk show. I wonder if Ellen ever has this trouble.
I bet you she does. Early on, if you watched Ellen, you might see some of that. So tell us a little bit about what you do, for work. Maybe let's start there.
Okay. What I do for work is I am a pastor, a licensed pastor, and I do pastoral counseling with people. And so a lot of people, what happens is I have a therapist that refer clients to me have had areas of wounding in the area of sexuality, and they're trying to reconcile, somehow figure out how does this fit with my being a Christian or with religion or with their spirituality. And so what I would call that, I really think that what my life mission is to help people deconstruct some of the areas of the ways in which religion has tried to define sexuality as one thing and anything physical is a separate thing.
Right.
And so I'm trying to help people to integrate their sexuality and spirituality in a healthy, whole way that helps them experience the pleasure and it helps them experience the wonder. And then also have to recognize some of the wounds that I want to say religion has actually imparted to them and that they've inherited.
Yeah.
So I'm a counselor is what I do.
Yep.
And then the other thing, the fun thing I'm doing right now is...
Yeah, tell us about fun parts.
I'm loving this. I'm doing a
New
podcast.
podcast.
It's a brand new podcast, yeah.
First episode dropped last week.
Second one dropped today. They drop on Hump Day,
Okay.
Wednesday.
Hey-oh.
Just want you to know. Okay, so we're going to use every innuendo there is.
Yes.
We're gonna maximize on that. But it's a group of 5 people that have come together that I want to say are just sitting around a table and we're having honest conversations about sexuality and spirituality.
Yeah.
And the thing that we're finding is we've got season 1 done and we're going to drop it a week at a time. But what we're finding is every conversation we thought, we had a well laid out agenda of what we were going to get through, and we made it through maybe 1 point, 2 points. Because what we find is everything that we're discussing has layers to it. And so we've started to unpack the layers. It is absolutely a fun podcast.
Yeah.
And it's serious. There are tears in it. But there is laughter and joy and weird things that happen that come out of our mouths in different ways. We are having so much fun, though.
Yeah.
I love this. And people have been asking me for ages if I would do something like this, but I am the least techie person on this planet.
Sure.
You know that for sure. I mean, you know that.
I mean, I've seen you with your iPhone at
Yeah.
times. Yeah, sure.
And everybody has to help me. And so I am the least digitally inclined person,
Yeah.
but other people are. And
Yep.
so they're taking care of that. So
beautiful.
I get to just show up and we get to talk about sex.
Yes.
So
I listened to episode 1 and there was, it starts, it's fun, it's whatever. And then like halfway through, I feel like this thing like found another level of, Laura and I were driving back from, the Bailey's farm. Many of you have been down there. You know Sylvia and Ted.
I know Sylvia.
We
Oh,
were
I
at
love. Hi,
and Ted
Sylvia. I hope you
Bailey's.
see this. Hi, Sylvia.
Yeah.
I miss you.
Lovely time there. And we're like, let's listen to the first episode. And driving down 52, and halfway through, you tell a story about kind of in an answer to the question of like, how did you get here in this conversation around like spirituality and sexuality? And waterworks. Would you tell that story?
Yeah, I will. It's. I'm always cautious when I'm telling stories because one of the things that my job is to hold sacred story in a place. And so I'm going to preface this story in that I told it, and then I had emails this week, 3 emails this week, that people said, was that story about me? And it was, which is so comforting to me, the element of being able to tell a story and have many people recognize themselves in it. So I use that as a preface to it.
But it wasn't any of these 3 people.
It wasn't any of those 3 people that I was actually, that I had, because what the producer of the show asked me, he said, will you pick somebody and put them in your mind and speak to them? And so that's what I was actually doing, is I was speaking to this one person that was probably was 20 years ago that I spoke to her.
So this story is not an isolated incident.
No, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not an isolated incident.
Okay.
And I think especially in the church, that's an important thing for us to recognize. What I've found repeatedly is if one person has a question, there are 25 people there that have that same question. Yeah. And so I'm retelling this story. I had a woman who was referred to me by a therapist that she had, in her marriage, what had happened, she'd been married for 17 years. And during the course of having sex over those 17 years, things started to show up that she had actually been able to suppress that were related to sexual abuse that had happened early on in her life. And so she came into my office, and she first came in and she was just like, she was sitting like this, like literally sitting like this. And she was like, there's nothing good about sex. And she says, but I don't know how to reconcile sexuality and spirituality in the same sentence. And I said, well, let's just talk about the God that you've experienced. Can we talk about that? And so we started to talk about the God that she had experienced, and she had an incredibly deep faith, beautiful faith. But one of the things that she said is, there's no way that anything that has to do with my body is good. And so we started talking about her hands, and I had her hold her hands out, and as we did a digit count on her fingers and everything, and I said, are these good? And then very gradually we worked ourselves down her body and being able to name body parts. And I said, we started to talk about the goodness of God and who God is, and the ways in which she'd experienced God over these 17 years of marriage, because she'd married her best friend. She was in love with her husband. Mm-hmm. She was just struggling because she was having these memories come back. And as she was doing this work with this sexual counselor, what she found is, she said, I can't reconcile my faith. And so as we started to talk about the goodness of who God was, at one point she literally has to stand up, and she just starts shaking her body, and she goes, oh my gosh, and she's just weeping. And she says, this body isn't a curse. I said, no, your body's not a curse. Your body's your body's this beautiful machine that is just, God created it to function fully for pleasure, for goodness, for connection. For work. She's a marathon runner. Yeah. She ran repeated marathons, and it was I said, all of that is good. So this genital region of your body is also good. And she looked at me and she said, if ever God and spirituality and sexuality could be put in the same sentence, and I could see God as good, she said, I want to know that God. Mm-hmm. Because the God I know right now isn't going to redeem anything until someday heaven. And that includes my body. And, I got to work with her for a couple of years, and what I watched happen is the lies that she had grabbed hold of gradually began to fall off, and she began to experience and have, not that she hadn't experienced some pleasure before, but she began to put it in a context of something as, oh, this is actually part of what God made me to experience. Right. And it became a different conversation over the course of the years. So
in this last week, one of the things we kind of explored in looking at Song of Songs, one of the more common ways of understanding it in the Christian tradition is that it's all allegorical. This is a story about God and our relationship with God. It's not really about our bodies and about sex, which I kind of agreed with some commentaries that I read on, and wanted to further the conversation, that it seems like in the church there has been this divorce or even hatred of these physical bodies that we have, and that really they're the problem, which I think this woman would testify to, that what she learned about God and sin and her body is that we're someday later in heaven, spiritual land. Yes. God will redeem. All of this will be redeemed. Including this awful, sinful, terrible thing that I have to endure until then. Which you can imagine the ways in which that gets worked out in our spiritual lives. Or in our physical lives. I want to say in physical, the reality is I have a memory from when I was a child. I was a teenager and I was at camp. And I remember we were at this park in New Brunswick, Texas, and we were sliding down these rocks and into the water, laughing, just having so much fun, utter delight. Yeah. And one of the camp counselors said, "This is so much fun. It's got to be sin." And I remember thinking, I'm a teenager, so when I'm not even a teenager, I'm probably 10 years old, and I'm hearing this camp counselor say that. And I remember thinking early on when I first began engaging in sex as a woman, what I realized, I kept thinking, this is so fun. Oh, if it's fun, it's got to be sin. And I think that wasn't necessarily, I never had anybody write that in my Sunday school lesson. Right. But I do think it's the unspoken in religion that has taught us for a very long time to divorce our bodies from anything that's pleasurable, for fear that anything pleasurable doesn't hold the potential of being spiritual. Right.
And so we've taught a theology kind of even, I want to say through silence a lot of times, but through assumption that this body can't possibly have experienced pleasure and do it in a way that it's experiencing spiritual goodness.
That some way it could honor God or be a part of our connection to the divine.
And I'm of the camp, and I want to say I've been doing this work for a long, I started literally, I can't believe this even, 35 years ago I started on this journey.
Wow.
So, actually 40 years ago I started on it, but it wasn't until I actually admitted to myself that I was on this journey until about 35 years ago. And I can't tell you the number of times I've thought, oh, okay, now I understand it.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I am just scratching the surface.
Yeah. Which one of the things that you always say is like, I reserve the right to write my theology in pencil. Have you changed your mind about anything related to sex and spirituality over the course of 35 years?
Oh my gosh. I could give you a long litany of what I think it'd be shorter to give you the things I'm still holding on to. That would be a shorter list.
What are some of the things you've kept?
One of the things I have kept is that God at the core is good, which I believe God is for us. And God did not create our bodies as something to test us. I don't think God created our bodies to be a burden to us. I think God created our bodies in multidimensional ways in order for us to experience what true goodness is. So that's one thing that has stayed is God is good.
Yeah.
Another thing that has stayed is sex is really fun and good. Now, I say that. The other thing I will say is anything that has the potential of creating this kind of life and this kind of power also holds a potential of evil.
Yep.
It does. So it just does. And I think what happens is, in fact, I think it was Jerome. It was either Augustine or Jerome that used to, anytime they had a fleshly thought, would throw themselves into thorn bushes to punish their body so that as the scars were healing, they would focus on the scars and not on the fleshly thoughts.
Right.
And so, I can't remember if it was Jerome or Augustine. But whoever it was, they are part of the translators of Scripture, why we have Scripture today, which I'm grateful for them.
Right.
But I want to say that that's one of the reasons why I think in Scripture we've had so much of what I would call sexual language taken out.
Sure.
And they didn't, I don't know how Song of Songs made it through. It had to make it through as an allegory because if you think about this is God's love for us, that God is going to ravish us.
Yeah.
I mean, we should be a little more concerned about
that interpretation than just this being about two humans.
About human beings being in this. I mean, shouldn't we?
That's a little
weird. That should turn our faces red and we go, oh wow, can I see God as lover?
Yeah, right.
So anyway, that's two.
Why do you think Christians have such a hard time with sex?
Well, I need more than just a couple of minutes for that one. But here's what I will say is I think that there's too many ways that what we've inherited isn't what we've experienced. So what I mean by that is when a child has a physical experience of pleasure, like when I have grandsons.
Yep.
So when they are enjoying that wonderful part of their body and they are just 100% there and it's utter delight.
Yeah.
But what I think has too often is given to children when they are in these natural places of experiencing their bodies in real ways is there is an adult experience from the pain that they've experienced that is then put on the child, and what it comes through is it has to dive through, I want to say, a pool of shame to get there. And what children are experiencing, I have people that all the time, how do you talk to your children about sex?
Yeah.
At what age is the appropriate age? And I'm like, you start before they're born. You start when they're born. You start in the womb. They are a sexual being.
Yeah.
Our sexual journey doesn't begin with a ring.
Yeah.
Our sexual journey begins in conception.
Yep.
and I use the terminology a lot of we all have a sexual portfolio.
Right.
We all do.
Which doesn't just include like our physical experiences with another human.
No.
But far
with ourself, it goes way, way back.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure I should tell this story. Oh, I might get in trouble. You could bleep it out though, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. Okay. When I was in junior high, we had what they call the presidential awards.
Okay.
And the presidential awards, you had to do so many sit-ups. You had to do so
Physical
many
fitness and gym.
Fitness and gym.
Totally.
Okay, so you had to do a certain number of things. And one of the things you had to do was climb a rope to the ceiling and ring a bell. And I experienced some deep pleasure while doing that. And I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I'm hanging onto a rope. I'm up above the gym. But I learned how to do it so quickly, and I could linger up there by the bell. And so my gym teacher repeatedly had me demonstrate the rope climb because I became proficient at it, because in my sexual portfolio, I was something was coming to life in me that was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. But I didn't have definition for it. And anybody else I talked to, like, when you climb the rope, does anything happen to you?
Yeah.
And nobody was confirming. I just didn't have any language for it. And I'm talking about, I was like, that's a shame to grow to that age and not have language or understanding about your body.
Sure.
So what happened in the Christian faith, I think, so often is we have to have the talk.
Right.
Versus, I want to say, can you have 100 1-minute sex talks with your kid?
Yeah.
And it will change the, I want to say the
landscape.
And the temperature of how sex is actually talked about. So I think that's really, going back to your question, why do we have such a problem about it? Is because we've inherited so much fear. And when something is inherited in fear, it is put on in fear.
Yeah.
And then it just creates this continual cycle.
Yeah. I talked last week, I talked about like fear and shame as our almost autonomic responses when we start talking about sex in the body.
Oh, there are guardrails.
Yeah.
100%. I think they're the guardrails versus can we have grace and curiosity?
Yeah.
I honestly think curiosity is what children are experiencing.
Sure.
And when I see a child experiencing their body in such pleasurable ways, what I'm often reminded of is like, oh, wait, God, that was me at one point, right? So can I see this experience as something that is curious? And can I see through that lens versus through all the different ways in which I have experienced, or the world or religion or whatever has taught me?
Yeah. As parents and once young parents, I remember we were having a conversation with somebody and they were saying like, well, how do you talk to your kids about sex, or when do you talk about sex with your kids? And somebody gave some really good advice to me, which was like, answer the questions when they ask them.
In the moment,
Which is like, oh yeah, answer the questions that are asked. And at some point, kids will digest that information, and they may ask a couple of questions, and then they're like, think about it, and they'll stop, and then you stop. And then when they ask the next question, you answer the next question. And then they think about it. So it was like this way of constantly engaging the conversation without saying like, what's appropriate or not appropriate, or when do I do this, or when do I talk about that? It's like, answer the questions that get asked.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I thought that was great. And also the other thing of like, what's normal, what you model as normal as a parent or in a family, like it becomes normal. So can we, as adults, experience conversations about sex and our bodies as normal?
Can we?
Well, I mean, that begs the question then, right? Like if we're going to model it for our kids in our homes, we have to figure out ways to do that work.
Well, and I think from my own experience, what I know for sure is that anything that I don't own is a falsehood I'm giving away.
Sure.
And so I would rather say, like, if somebody asks me a question about something sexually that I'm not comfortable talking about, it is 10 times better to say, oh, this makes me a little uncomfortable to talk about it. And that's what I found along the way, is to be able to acknowledge my discomfort lowers the fear factor in the room right away.
Sure.
So it's not coming out through fear. It's coming from, okay, can we agree that, okay, this is a little uncomfortable?
Sure,
And
right.
so I think that the way for adults to start talking about it is to be able to, my husband and I had a friend when we were growing up not when we were growing up, I'm sorry, early in our marriage, there was a friend of ours that every time he talked about sex, he would touch his glasses and he'd lower his glasses. And we're sitting in a Burger King one time, and I looked across the table at him, and I'll call him Ken. And I said, Ken, every time you say the word sex, you lower your glasses. And he goes, I can say sex. Oh, I do touch my glasses, don't I? And I was like, yeah. I said, I think it's just a nervous thing. What, are you uncomfortable talking? Because I don't even remember what we were talking about, but somehow we were using the word sex in what we were talking about. And just that, being able to acknowledge it was like suddenly, then our conversations went to a deeper level.
Sure.
But we had to first acknowledge our discomfort.
Yeah.
And so that's not anything to be ashamed of.
Right.
It's just to notice where you're at. And that's one of the things from your sermon last week that you said, can we name where we're at right now?
Yeah, right.
We'll never go anyplace else if we don't first name where we're at.
Yeah.
And live in that and go, oh, okay, so this is what I'm comfortable with.
If I'm not mistaken, that's the first question in the Bible. Where are you?
Oh, yeah.
So, Becky, you know that I'm also a pastor of a church. And there's a whole group of people who, are part of this community, and they listen, and they... So if I asked you, what is a message, or what are a couple of things that you really hope or wished for a spiritual community in this conversation, right? We looked at Song of Songs last week, which is this beautiful poetic love, passion, desire, intimacy, and you've spent a huge part of your life. What do you hope the church starts to grasp, or what's a wish that you have for people who follow this Jesus?
I have never been asked that question, and I love it. So I'm just kind of savoring the taste of that just right now. The first thing I would say is that we would reclaim curiosity. Curiosity about God, curiosity about our bodies, and curiosity about what it means to actually be both sexual and spiritual. Because I think the thing that the Jesus that I see in Scripture repeatedly, and the Jesus that I choose to follow, is one who always pauses and does exactly what you're talking about, responds to a question. But normally, and this is what I think is so helpful with children also, and I am getting back to the question, but it's like, isn't afraid to ask a question of the question.
Sure.
And that's like maybe a double negative, but a double negative makes a positive.
In maths.
In math. So I wonder if the church began to be curious versus being so dogmatically defined, we might be able to explore the dimensions of sexuality from a place of curiosity, which the second thing I think that my hope for the church is that they would have compassion. Because one of my friends on the podcast talks about it this way, is that the one thing she's absolutely 100% sure of is the hospitality of God. And that Jesus is always living from a place of hospitality.
Right.
And I think that comes from this deep inner compassion that Jesus had both for who he was and who humanity was. And part of what Jesus coming in physical form,
Right.
I don't think was to show us who God was. That feels very egotistical. And I think it's Dallas Willard who says it. Jesus came to show us who we as humans are capable of being.
Right.
And I think with curiosity, we get to explore, and with compassion, we get to engage. And I think that leads me to I have a third one, is because ultimately what our sexuality and our spirituality coming together is about creating new life in us and in others. Because yes, it can create new life like a child. That's why all of us are here.
Yeah.
But it can also create life because for many people, like for this woman that I told the story about, it wasn't until she was actually engaged in a safe covenant relationship that these things that she had disassociated from even had permission to show up in her.
Yeah.
And I want to say that, to me, that was one of the themes we explored with her was that the compassion of God? Like, you're in a place now, your husband is committed in this. He doesn't like it necessarily, but he's committed to helping you walk this out. And that to me felt like we had to do the work of curiosity. She had to experience the compassion, and ultimately what it did is it created deeper life in her marriage. And that's what I have for the church. The church is, we have an opportunity. We don't have to be as afraid of this because fear creates more fear. And it creates these dogmas of it's this way and it's this way. And it's like we've created this instead of, I think, the flowing lines of grace and compassion.
And it seems to me that the fear is, it's both an honest assessment of like the power of sex.
Absolutely.
Right? Like this thing, it does have the potential to destroy human life or another person. And so there is a respect, I think, maybe would be a better way to frame it than to be afraid of it. Because it does have this.
Or is it another dimension of fear?
Sure.
I hear what you're saying, but there is an element here of awe is another dimension of fear, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so that's the other side of the coin with it.
Yeah.
And I think my other wondering is, what if we didn't have to have all the answers?
Sure.
And that's where our curiosity comes in.
Yeah.
We don't have to have all the answers. But you know what? I'll explore that with you. I'll sit with you. Let's unpack this. And I mean, right now we're sitting in a church surrounded by this stained glass that people etched things that were of value to them in the stained glass. That's craftsmanship. What if the church actually had a craftsmanship around who we are as human beings and our spirituality and sexuality being interwoven? I mean, would that really be good news? I mean, that would let some light shine through. I'm just like, these have stood the test of time.
Yeah.
I just wonder what would happen if we took a different, instead of it being riddled in fear and shame.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind to me in that journey is like a radical and desperate dependence on the leading of the Spirit, right?
Absolutely,
Which I think we can say the Spirit of God will. Jesus says it's the Spirit of truth, and so we can like submit ourselves to that leading and that guiding, to be curious, to ask questions, to wonder, to not feel like we have to have all the answers when we're not driving this thing. Like it's the Spirit of the risen Christ, present among us and in us, and so I think a deeper pneumatology or like a deeper commitment to like that classic Christian idea might do us well in this conversation.
Well, and I think if we're going to have this conversation, and you as a pastor who have a voice that is listened to, part of what has to be looked at is how do we view desire and how do we view passion?
Sure.
And I think that we've got to develop a relationship of language, of helping people reconnect, because just as I have a desire to eat a hamburger, that's dripping with goodness, we equate that as somehow that's an acceptable desire, but to have a physical desire in the genital region is somehow immediately equated with
shame,
oops, it's shame.
fear.
That can't be good.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, it's a desire showing up here. What are we going to do with this?
Yeah. And I
desire.
mean, like, my first question to that is like, where does that come from? Like, I learned that from someone, somewhere, some place along the way. I learned that. And I don't think it has to be that way.
I don't think it does. And that's where I
Yeah.
think that we can teach more about respect and consent than just rules and don't.
Well, there you go.
So,
Well, Becky, I'm grateful for you and like my friendship with you. I'm also grateful for your voice in
thank you.
Into our community, into the community that you're a part of, but broader. I'm super excited about Fun Parts.
I
And,
am too.
like,
I love it.
what happens with that podcast? That's going to be wild.
Yeah.
So typically we end our gatherings with communion. I'm wondering if you would be willing to lead us in communion and
I would love to.
offer Eucharist. People out there, they've been told like, hey, when you gather, make sure you have bread and wine if you want to do that. So I think they're ready.
On the night that Jesus was handed over, he took something that was very common. He took the bread, and he was at the table, and he said, take. Every time you eat this, but break it first. Man, this is hard. This is my body broken for you. But I want you to take this, and I want you to take something that you're going to engage with all the time. I want you to take, and I want you to do this in remembrance of me. And part of that is the invitation to come back present to what is in a very physical way, come back to something and let it remind us of who Jesus is. And then he took the cup and he lifted it up and he said, this is my blood poured out for you. And when you drink this in remembrance of me. And every time I engage with both the bread and the wine, I am reminded that two very different elements are coming together, and that only when they unite and are in union together do they actually create communion. And to me, that feels like this incredible sacred element of who God is and how Jesus is inviting us to experience community with one another, but also to experience both joy and sorrow, both laughter and pain, because all of it belongs here at the table. So this is the table, not of the church, but of the Lord. It's made ready for those who love God and for those who want to love God more. It's made ready for those who have tried to follow Christ and those we who have failed. But it's the invitation from Jesus is to come. Come, drink deeply, eat deeply, because this is for you. And it is for the forgiveness of sins. But it's just for the utter delight of getting to be with you.
So friends, as you take the bread, the body of Christ, broken for you, take and eat. And as you take the cup, the blood of Christ shed for you, take and drink. I usually do the Aaronic blessing from Numbers at the end.
I don't know that one.
Would you be willing to bless the people in some other way?
Oh, okay, so I can do something my own?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I would love to. May God, your Creator, remind you of the goodness of who you are. May God, your lover, remind you of the goodness of who you are. May God, your mother or father, remind you of the goodness of who you are and all the wonder of what you have yet to discover. May the peace that is already ours continue to unfold and invite us to discover and hunger for more. Bless you.
Grace and peace, friends. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.